Well, the reason why I'm here today is to get more information about exactly what the UN is doing, and to see, to also network with other people with which I share the same interest with.
I'm Nick Young, I'm Chief Executive of the Red Cross, and I've been chairing one of the panels today.
My name's Peter Scott Bowden, I'm from the World Food Programme. I work in the Emergency Response Division.
I'm also here to hear what these amazing speakers have got to say.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Kettle. I'm the Vice President of the United Nations Youth and Student Association of the UK.
I'm Abby Williams, and I'm Vice President of the Centre for Conflict Analysis and Prevention.
There's a lot of things that the UN needs to tackle in current times. I would say war.
I'm very involved in climate change.
The fair trade system.
Millennium Development Goals like the climate change, like nuclear proliferation and disarmament.
Strong global partnerships, obviously supporting the capacity of developing countries to build their institutions and build the skills base and the capacity to do wonderful things.
We've been talking about the humanitarian challenges that we face.
New experiment we're trying today of having a really big outreach conference, which is designed to bring in people way beyond our own membership.
We have great examples of policies that work, which can be adapted to a very wide range of countries' own circumstances. We need to get in behind those strategies and make sure they're rolled out as widely as they can.
It sounded like a really good opportunity for everybody to talk about the main issues of the UN and sort of like actually collectively come together. What we need to do, how the main issues of the world can be addressed, how to reform the UN.
Rainfall patterns are increasingly erratic. In many places, cycles of drought and floods have replaced the traditional patterns of rainfall.
That in halting and fragmentary ways, our international community is slowly developing rules and structures that may help it to minimize the use of armed force, the scourge of war.
We have seen the wave of devastating natural disasters, the global recession, the lingering effects of the food and fuel crises, and bear in mind that food prices are still very high by historic levels for many developing countries. We see the reality of climate change. All these things conspire to thwart development progress. While the impact has undoubtedly been a setback, though, to hard-fought development gains, it is imperative that it does not become an excuse for lowering our level of ambition for the MDGs. On the contrary, it makes achieving them more urgent and more compelling. We need to be fostering models of inclusive and balanced economic growth. We have to improve opportunities for women and girls. That will be such a powerful driver of progress across every Millennium Development Goal and indeed development indicator generally. We need to target investments in health and education, clean water and sanitation, and in the professionals who run these services. We see it as important to scale up social protection and employment programs and other such targeted interventions. We've seen social protection and cash transfer programs expand access to nutritional supplements, increase the frequency of health checkups, and keep children in school. So rather than being seen as a drain on a nation's budget in hard times, social protection needs to be seen as absolutely a critical investment in building the resilience within a society to withstand present and future shocks. Countries must be enabled to mobilise the domestic resources to finance the Millennium Development Goals. Most of the resources needed to achieve the MDGs have to be raised and allocated effectively from within a country itself. The international community does need to deliver on the official development assistance commitments that it's made and improve the predictability and the effectiveness of aid.
Climate change is an incredibly serious human rights issue, perhaps the most serious issue of this century, because of the impact already on people who are living in poor countries, in small islands, or on the coast in cities that are going to be affected by sea levels.
I think I'm inclined to think that probably climate change is the most dangerous of all, because we haven't got a choice really. In the case of nuclear weapons, we can choose whether to go on developing them or whether to get rid of them, and obviously we ought to get rid of them. But in the case of climate change, it creeps up on you. It's getting worse and people aren't noticing in quite the same way.
The icon of climate change is the polar bear on a melting ice floe. We need it to be a poor farmer or a poor indigenous person. I'd like to use my remarks to reflect on the links between development, climate change and human rights. We're not going to make lasting progress in any of these areas unless we make progress on all of them. For far too long, we left climate change discussions primarily within the realm of science. There was a general perception amongst the public, especially in industrialized countries, which are the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, that negative impacts of climate change were, first, a possibility rather than a certainty. Second, a threat to the future rather than to the present. And third, a threat to plants, trees, animals, and icebergs rather than to humans. The impacts of climate change are happening today and are already of great consequence, in particular on impoverished communities in developing countries. The frequency of severe storms and what we sometimes call rogue weather events is increasing, taking the lives of poor people, destroying livelihoods, and ruining infrastructure like roads, schools, and health clinics. Sea level rise is threatening whole civilizations in places like the Cataract Islands, as I mentioned, and the Maldives. In Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the 60% of African cities that lie on a coast, sea level rise is slowly taking away the very land that people live on. These are only a few of the human impacts from climate change facing people across the world. And in turn, these impacts cause others that may represent our greatest challenges in the future, including large-scale increases in migration. We also face potentially greater conflicts over land, water, and other resources. Given these enormous impacts, many of us were hopeful that the negotiators and world leaders gathered at the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen last December would act swiftly and decisively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But as we know, the results of Copenhagen were disappointing. We didn't get the fair, ambitious and binding deal that would have signalled a course correction for the UNCCC negotiations. Our politicians generally failed us. They did not rise above narrow national self-interest, a self-interest that is too often driven by climate skeptics and, I have to say, by the fossil fuel industries themselves. Country commitments to greenhouse gas reductions, rather than creating a global target towards which all countries must aim, has created the so-called gigaton gap, the gap between the science and the pledges, that the politics need to catch up with the science as a matter of urgency. There's only one solution, and it has to be within a UN framework: greater international cooperation. This requires greater awareness, greater trust, and a greater global commitment to holding political leaders accountable for protecting the rights of people across the planet. We cannot afford to let our fellow human beings who are vulnerable bear the brunt. A climate justice approach demands that we distribute burdens fairly and that polluters pay. Those of us who have, over the last 50 years, rapidly used the very finite atmospheric resources we share must be prepared to shoulder the burden of contributing to the costs of adapting to climate change and finding low-carbon growth paths for developing countries.
It's a tremendous privilege to be here at this event, and I think it is very encouraging to see the tremendous turnout and lots of young people who are interested in the United Nations and its work.
We just want to know how to be there to make a difference and contribute with our skills and knowledge and our youth.
And the enthusiasm that was expressed there by the youngsters, as far as being associated in one way or another with the UN.
I was very impressed by the by the scale, the size of the conference, and by the fact you've got people from many generations and many different backgrounds and countries. It's excellent, really good, very impressive.
I can't wait to hear Hans Blix. He's on in a minute, isn't he?
North Korea is the strangest of states. I think if there were such a category as a psychotic state, it would fall within it. But the real worry about North Korea is that the deterrent concept doesn't work with North Korea for the straightforward reason that this is a government that doesn't much care if a lot of its civilians die. A lot of its civilians have died, have starved to death, under a government which is not all that worried about the fact that that's happening. I don't believe Iran is a psychotic state. I think it's a very complicated state. It's a state with many layers of government. And I personally believe it is still possible to reach some sort of understanding with Iran, though Dr. Blix will have much more to say in a much more expert way about it.
In the case of Iran, as in the case of the DPRK, military action is not an option. After the Iraq War, it is a bit surprising that no one seems to discuss the legality of an armed action against Iran. In my view, there is no way an attack on Iran could be legal. The Security Council will surely not authorize an armed intervention, and no state can contend that alleged Iranian intentions to make a nuclear weapons constitute an armed attack, giving a right to armed action and self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter.
I think the part of the United Nations which needs the most reforming, without question, is probably the Security Council. And this is a subject that's come up time and time again, because it really does represent the world as it was after the end of the Second World War. And I think that does rather mean that the wider UN community feels a bit frustrated that the international will is sometimes thwarted and that the Security Council doesn't properly reflect global opinion.
As you say, I worked for over 4 decades for the UN, which I always say is, I think, the best definition of an optimist that I know. So I have come to the view now that the only way in which we can bring about real reform is to concentrate on a few key changes that would have a multiplier effect. And let me say in passing, of course, when people talk about the UN reform, it's happened a little bit today earlier, we all talk about Security Council reform. Well, of course, that is very important. And as Baroness Williams says, the Security Council no longer represents the world of today. But that is very difficult to make progress on, and there are so many other areas where things could be done that would make that difference.
The reason why the United Nations is weak is not because of any inherent weaknesses in the United Nations. It's because policy decisions were made in the major capitals to keep the United Nations weak. It would actually be more logical, more sensible, more rational for the Western countries to make a major policy switch and say, maybe in the past, it was in our interest to keep the UN weak. Now, it's in our interest to keep the UN strong because it may help to constrain the rising powers that are emerging.
Not all UN member states are interested in an effective United Nations all the time. It can be a much more effective instrument if its member states are better organized in their legislative bodies like the General Assembly and give clearer directives to the Secretariat, along with the flexibility to carry out those directives and then hold the Secretariat accountable. We need to rebuild the international civil service and create a truly 21st century Secretariat. A capable and effective Secretariat is essential to the work of the United Nations. And this means ensuring that the best talent is recruited and retained. And it also means changing the way the Secretariat operates and the way its resources are allocated. And it also means changing this deep intrusion you now have on the part of the member states into the recruitment, the management of the Secretariat. So the challenge then is to adapt the UN so that it can perform its vital functions in the 21st century.
I think it's been an absolutely incredible day to see so many people here concerned about their world. You know, with the financial crisis and everything, it's very easy for people to get very inward looking, but not at all. Here we've had 1,500 people really concerned about their world and how we can make it a better place, and I think that's a great thing.
This September, we'll mark the 2/3 point on the road to achieving the MDGs. We must weave together the issues of human rights, decent work, sustainable development and protecting the environment.
And with the new Obama administration and with the new atmosphere, I think that we can go much further. And I welcome the movement towards Global Zero. And I think it is very important that the young people engage themselves in this. It is your world, after all, that's going to take over. So do away with these things. Work towards that goal.
It's been a long day and it's been a lot of information, a lot to take in. I had the privilege of helping one of the workshops in the capacity as president of UNISA, so representing the youth branch of the UNA, talking about possible careers in the UN, which a lot of young people were eager to hear more about.
The UN can never afford to have a single issue which it tackles to the exclusion of all others. It's become an organisation which is so much at the centre of finding responses to the global challenges we face that it can't afford really to say, well, we're going to do this or that and ignore all the rest. It has to do a lot of things at the same time.
No single actor can achieve the MDGs or promote sustainable development or tackle the global problems we face. The UN, however, as a convener of nations, a contributor of big ideas with global reach, and a mobiliser of collective international will and commitment to act for development, is absolutely indispensable to overcoming development challenges, working in partnership with others.
It seems to me that what the UN has got to focus on doing is bringing people together, bringing countries together, bringing NGOs together, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, the commercial sector, all trying to work together, not only to increase the capacity of the global fire brigade, if you like, to deal with crisis and disaster, but building capacity in country to deal with the problems that each country faces. That's got to be the key, and the UN has a key role to play.
Now, meeting today's global challenges, sustainable development, global warming, financial stability and disarmament, calls for accommodation, cooperation and the full use of international organizations with the United Nations at the center. Accelerating international interdependence will drive the world in this direction, and UN associations and civil society has an important role to help in the process. Let me end, Chairman, by citing my compatriot Dag Hammarskjöld, who once said that the UN might not take us to heaven, but it might help us to avoid hell.